So this is a video on how to link ServiceNow, Jenkins and Ansible to achieve a fully automated IT service pipeline. It does not go into the installation of all these tools, that is out of scope, but it shows how to link them together. So in order to do this, we combine the ServiceNow as a front end. And you can sign up for a ServiceNow dev account and easily get access to this. In order to execute commands with ServiceNow on our local network, you can set up a MID server. That is well documented as well, how to set that up, but it's just a VM running in your local environment. And via that, you can then trigger different things, like, for example, a Jenkins pipeline. Jenkins, in turn, will kick off Ansible, a playbook, and Ansible will change a setting via the playbook on a server. And that setting will then be entered, of course, originally by the user via the self-service portal on ServiceNow. So let's have a look at what that actually looks like once we have set it up, just as an example of how this will work once it's done. So in ServiceNow, the user can go in and simply access this. We have set up a catalog item. And the catalog item will change the NTP setting on the iDRAC of the server. We've just arbitrarily chosen that because it's very quick. If you look at the iDRAC in the settings folder, the settings page, we can see that the current setting in here is 1.jp.pool.ntp.org, right? So if you go through the ServiceNow self-service portal, we should easily be able to change that. So that is now set to 77, and if we issue the order, that will go through immediately. We haven't set up any costs or any approval flow for this, but it's easy to do that if you would like to as well. So if we now go and refresh the iDRAC, in between we've had both Jenkins and Ansible execute to make this happen, but now we can see then the result is that the iDRAC setting here for NTP has changed. So how do we actually set this stuff up? Well, let's have a look at how this is done. Let's start with what's closest to the server, and that's the Ansible part. So we're just verifying that we can execute the settings with Ansible. I have a full video on how to set up Ansible for use with PowerEdge servers in particular, and I will link that in the video description. So if we look at the playbooks that we have in here now, one of them is to set the NTP settings. So if we look at that, we have a single variable, NTP server 1, and we also enable NTP plus we are sending through that NTP server 1 setting to the iDRAC. So let's just verify that this works. So we'll execute the playbook, but first let's change the setting since it's already 1.jp.pool, etc. We just change that to a different value. Instead of 1, we can do, let's say, 5. And we save that file, and then we execute the Ansible playbook against the server, and of course that will update this setting. Just verify that that has actually taken place by refreshing this page. And there you are. So that has been updated. So of course the playbook works. Now, how about triggering this with Jenkins? How do you link Jenkins and Ansible? You can see there that's the next step, right? So Jenkins will trigger Ansible, Ansible will execute the playbook, and the playbook will update the changes then on the server itself. So in Jenkins, first of all, in order to make this work, we have to install 2 plugins. I've installed the recommended ones to start with anyway, but if you went to the plugin page, look at what's installed, you can see that the first one that we need, of course, is the Ansible plugin, because we want to trigger Ansible with this. The second one, since we want to have variables input to this from the outside, we need the parameterized trigger plugin. So if you add those two, you should be okay. So using those two plugins, we have created a project, and let's go in and configure that so you can see how that is set up. First of all, we have to check then the box that this project is parameterized, and thanks to that plugin we get that option. We have one parameter, NTP1, for that NTP server setting, and as a troubleshooting step we just have 0 in there in case things don't work out, we know. As a build trigger, that is then from the outside, then when we trigger Jenkins from the outside, we have the ability to do that. And I've just entered in ABC123 as the authentication for this. So you can see here there is a URL that we can use to trigger it, and we will use Postman a little bit later on to showcase that as well, to show how we can trigger Jenkins outside. But for this, let's just use Jenkins as is. Now, in the Ansible part, we have specified where the playbook is, and thanks to the fact that Jenkins and Ansible are installed on the same host, we can just point to that path, and that works. Now, you'd think this would be everything, but it's not. In order for Jenkins to update the Ansible playbook with the right values, we have to change that NTP1 value that we have into NTP server 1. So in the playbook, we have NTP server 1, which is the key, and the value that we pass through to Jenkins is NTP1. As you can see here, if you look at the playbook, that's the variable that we have there for the NTP server that we need to update. So Jenkins will pass that through, and we will provide the value up here as NTP1. It's one of the parameters. We can just test this out to see if it works with Jenkins as is. So we'll just run that build. It says build with parameters, which we got thanks to that plugin. So if we click on that, we will get the option to enter the NTP value. And just to verify then, to show that this really is from Jenkins, we just enter in a specified value there. So you can see that it is Jenkins that we're doing this with. You can see the build running, and it finishes very quickly. It does, of course, not take very long to execute Ansible. And if you look at the iDRAC settings now, refresh this page, we'll keep doing this for every step, just so you can see how everything is connected. But if you refresh this, you can now see that that has been updated, and it says Jenkins test value in there. Now, the next step then is to use the API for Jenkins, and that's later on what we're going to use to link ServiceNow and Jenkins, but let's just test that standalone to start with. To do that, we have Postman, and Postman is a very useful tool to do this. All we do is enter in the IP address, port, and the URL for Jenkins. You can see it's the same IP address, same port, and the URL that we use for it is specified down here. So we have job and then NTP, which is NTP is the name of the project that we have right now. You can name that anything, but then you have to change that. And then we have the token that we specified. And we also have the we have the token and build with parameters specified in there as well. So if we go into Postman, you can see that we have that whole URL in there, and we can change this to something more interesting just to showcase that we are using Postman to do this. And we've got to update, it's not NTP2, it's NTP1. That is our variable name. You can see here that we have authentication as well, that is set to basic authentication. The username admin and the password that you can see is the username and password for Jenkins. You can see we got a 201 created back, so that was successful. If we look at Jenkins, we can see here now that it has accepted that API call as a trigger for our project. And that is now finished. So again, if we go back and look at the iDRAC and refresh this page, we should see that the value has now again been updated. And there you go. So it is possible now to trigger Jenkins from the outside using an API. Now, how about doing it from ServiceNow? So if you go to the dev instance that we have in ServiceNow, and we look at, there's a very long list of different things that we can do here, but let's go down and look for a REST message that we can send. So that is outbound REST message. And here we are creating a new one, and we are specifying the URL that we have for our Jenkins instance. You can see that's the endpoint there, the URL. If you look at the request, you can see we have the authorization in here. The reason that we are using this and not the authentication tab on the side is because the workflow doesn't accept that. It doesn't work with it later on. You'll see it later on. So this is where Postman is very handy. Just look at the headers here. These are automatically created by Postman. You can just copy and paste from here, the key and the value. And if you paste that in here in ServiceNow, it will authenticate properly even later on when we're using a workflow. So the actual message that we are sending is a GET message. I have even named it GET. The method is GET, of course. Endpoint is the same as before. And we have a couple of parameters that we have to pass through. And let's see. The first one is NTP, of course, NTP1. And since we want to have this replaced later on when the user fills in the form, it is set as a variable, so you got the curly brackets around it. And then we have the token that we have specified as part of the authentication method for Jenkins. Now we'd like to test this, but of course in order to do that we need to specify that we want to have this command issued not directly from the cloud, but via our MID server, because our MID server is sitting inside, as you can see, our network. And that's the only way that we can reach the Jenkins installation, since the Jenkins installation is local to us. So since we have a variable here, we can click on automatically generate the variables, and ServiceNow will create that for us so we can do a test. We do want to specify this for our test, so we just enter in something that we can recognize easily once it's updated on the address. So our NTP server now will be test from ServiceNow. Certainly not a valid server name, but we'll use it anyway for this test. Now let's execute that. We should see if everything is successful. We should get a HTTP 201 back, showing that it is created, and that's what we're getting. So let's go back to Jenkins, and we can see here it's been triggered, job number 33, and it's very quick. So refresh the page there, and everything goes well. We should see that the time zone, the NTP server has now been updated. So now it works to combine, to basically kick this off from ServiceNow. But how do we set it up in ServiceNow? So ServiceNow is quite complicated. Well, first of all, we have a user, and the user needs to fill in this value on a form, a request form. That will be stored in a variable called NTP1. That variable will be sent to a workflow, and the workflow will capture the variable and trigger our REST message that we just saw. So in order to get that to work, we have to also create the workflow. So if you scroll down, you have workflow on the side, workflow editor. And we're going to create a very simple one. Actually, we're going to use one that I have, but I'll go through each one of the steps that is in there so that you can see how it is created. Is it 2? Nope. It's 3, workflow 3. So let's create this with any name you want, of course. So this is our workflow, very simple. We have a start and an end, and in between we are running a script to capture the variables, and in between then we also have our REST message that we are sending out to the Jenkins installation. We check some of the settings here. You can see it's very, very basic. We also need to check this out first, because if we don't check it out, we can't modify it, we can't check all the settings. You can see here that always, so in the begin process, we always have this link then that triggers our script. So that's always true, and it triggers this get NTP server value part of our workflow, which is the next step. Now, a very important point for this is in order for the workflow to show up in our form later on, you have to have the table set to scRecItem. If it is anything else, it will not show up on the form page, so you can't actually select this workflow. So please make sure that's the table that you have selected. We also have a variable, so I've entered in the NTP1 variable here as a normal line of text. And that's essentially what you need here. Now on the script part, that is also very simple. All we do is to capture that single variable that we are getting the user to input. So the workflow input then is NTP1, and we are storing that value as NTP1, the same name. And the reason we're doing this is that we want to use this value when we trigger the REST call in the next step. So if we look in there, we can see that we are issuing the REST message that we created earlier, we had a look at earlier, and of course the function is get. You can get with variables, and the variable that we are sending through is this NTP1 variable that we have had the user enter previously through the form. It will show the form in the next step. Now, of course, we have to use the MID server in order to execute this, since otherwise the ServiceNow instance cannot reach our local Jenkins installation. I have linked both the success and the error options in here to the end. And the reason I'm doing this is that in case something goes wrong, the only way to actually see the error messages is if you have linked this error or defaulted state to the ending state as well. So in that case, it'll save any error output that you can use to troubleshoot if things go wrong. And that's the entire workflow. So it's very, very simple. We don't have any approval. We have nothing else either. So we just publish this. And once it's published, we can use it. So let's now go back and have a look at our catalog item. So in order to link this together, you need only really the variable and also link the workflow. So let's go in and edit this. So I've entered in just some general information as a description for this, so users know what it is. And if you go down, you have a look there, you can see that you have one variable, and that is, as you can see, single line text. If you click on that, we will see that it is labeled as NTP1. And that's really it there. And the question is, what do we ask the user really? And we store that answer in NTP1. You can see that of course is the same thing as we're capturing here in the workflow. Now, in order to execute this with the workflow, we have to link the workflow there. So if we go and have a look at that part, the process engine, and there we have the workflow, Jenkins workflow 3, which is of course the same one that we just looked at. And again, it won't show up unless the correct table name has been specified in the properties, as we saw earlier. And that's really all you need for this form. Now, let's try it out and see if it actually works. We can enter in something a bit more descriptive here now, rather than just 77. And that of course goes through immediately. If we go and look at Jenkins, that has now been triggered as job number 34. And of course finishes very quickly, so then again for the final time go and look at the iDRAC page. And we can now see that that has been updated correctly. So that's how you link all of those tools together to create an automated service platform. Thank you very much.